Classes and IDs allow us to specifically target elements based on their class or ID attributes. The main difference between a class and an ID is that IDs are unique and they're used to identify one element on a page, whereas a class can be used to classify and target more than one element. So first up, let's talk about selecting elements with CSS class selectors. A class selector targets an element based on its class attribute. So in our HTML file, let's go ahead and add class attributes and values to some of our elements. We'll then create a few styles for them in our style sheet because currently our page has no author styles applied. So in our HTML file, we'll start with the first div in the document. So we'll go ahead and give it a class attribute followed by an equal sign and a set of quotation marks. Now, naming the class is up to us, and it's usually good practice to give classes meaningful names that explain what they do and what their purpose is. Because this div contains or wraps the other elements in the document, we'll go ahead and give it the class name container. So we'll save our HTML file, and we'll go into our style.css file where we'll need to create the class selector for container. Classes are defined by using the dot character followed by the class name. So we'll first type a dot followed by container and a set of curly braces. We'll then create a few styles for our new container class. So I will give it a width property with the value 740 pixels, followed by a margin property and the value auto, which will center our div element on the page. So when we save our CSS file and refresh the browser, we see the width of the container element reduced to 740 pixels, and it's now centered in the browser. So next, let's add a class to our header element. Now, we could maybe just use this header element type selector to select it, but let's instead give it the class name main header. Because again, we'll want to give it a meaningful class name. And since we know this will always be the main header in our page or website, the main header class name communicates that very clearly. So we'll go ahead and type main-header. So we'll save the HTML file and go back into the style sheet where we'll need to create the class selector for main header. So again, I'll type a dot followed by main-header and a set of curly braces. Then I will give it a height property with a value of 110 pixels, followed by color white, and finally a background property with the value royal blue. So when we save the style sheet and refresh our browser, we can see that our header is now 110 pixels tall, the text color is white, and the background is royal blue. Back in our HTML file, let's add a class attribute to the next div element in the document, and we'll go ahead and give it the value main content. I'm giving it the class name main content because the div contains the main content on the page, like headings and paragraphs. So in our style.css file, I'll create the selector for main content, and I will give it a padding property with a value of 20 pixels and a background value of light gray. So I'll save the style sheet, and when we refresh the browser, we see that light gray background and the 20 pixels of padding separating the content from the edges of the div. Finally, let's add a class to our footer element. We'll give it the class name main footer because again, like main header, it's a meaningful class name since this will always be the main footer in our page. So we'll save our HTML file And in our style sheet, we'll create our class selector for main footer. I will give it a height of 100 pixels and a text color of white, and I will give it a background value with a shade of black. So when we save our style sheet and refresh the browser, there we see our new footer styles. CSS class selectors are very useful because they can be reused throughout a page. So multiple elements can share the same class, and an element can also have multiple classes applied to it. So for example, let's create a new class selector named base, where I will give it some top padding. I'll also make the text color white. I'll align the text center and give it a font size of 24 pixels. So I'll save the style sheet and go into our HTML file, where we can then add the new base class value to any of these classes. We'll just need to separate them with a space. So we'll go ahead and add it to the main header and main footer values. So again, we'll just add a space followed by base. And in our footer, I'll add a space followed by base. When we save our HTML file and refresh the browser, there we see those new base styles applied to the header and the footer. So it applies those new styles on top of the ones they already have. Like with type selectors, we can also create descendant selectors with classes. So for example, in our CSS file, I will select main content. I will follow it with a space, then select every paragraph inside main content, where I will give them a font size of 21 pixels and a line height of 1.5 and a margin top value of 32 pixels. When we save the style sheet and review it in the browser, I'll click refresh. We can see how the paragraph text is much larger and the lines of text are spaced out with the line height and margins. So next, let's talk about ID selectors. An ID selector targets an element based on its ID attribute. What makes IDs different from classes is that IDs are unique to the page. So an element can only have one ID, and a page can only have one element with the same ID name. So in our HTML file, let's go ahead and change this main content class attribute in our markup here to an ID attribute. So now, because our div already has an ID applied, we can no longer add IDs to it, and we cannot use this main content ID anywhere else in this HTML file like we could with classes. So I'll save our HTML file, and next we'll need to change our CSS selector. ID selectors are created by using the pound symbol. So in our style sheet, we'll just need to switch the period in our selector here with the pound symbol. So when we save this and refresh the browser, notice how the main content div element still has its padding and background styles applied. The paragraphs, however, have lost their font size, line height, and margins because we've changed their parent element to an ID. So in our style sheet, we'll simply need to adjust this descendant selector by changing the main content class selector to an ID. So now when we refresh, our paragraphs are once again styled with the larger font size, line height, and top margins. We can apply both a class and an ID to an element, but keep in mind that IDs carry more specificity than classes do. So if an element has an ID and a class applied, the styles defined in the ID selector will always carry more weight than the styles defined in the class selector. So we'll need to make sure we don't share properties between classes and IDs. IDs also have browser functionality. They can be used as what are called fragment identifiers for creating landmarks or anchors in pages. I'll show you what I mean. So if we give the header at the top of our page here an ID attribute and the value top, then at the very bottom of the page, we'll go ahead and add a link, and we will give it an href value of pound top. Whenever we click on a link with an href value of pound top, the browser will locate the element with the ID of top, and it will jump right to that section of the page. So for the sake of this example, I'll go ahead and increase the height of our main content div to about 800 pixels so we can really see how this works. So when I save both files and refresh the browser, notice how our height has been extended. And when we scroll down and click our back to top link here, the browser takes us right back up to the top of the page because we've instructed it to find the element with the ID of top, which in our case is the header.